Hello? Is anyone there?
Do you believe that a man, haunted for 15 years by the death of his wife and son, could find forgiveness? Not from another human, but from a creature of legend? In 1987, deep in the forests of North Carolina, an unspoken pact began between a guilt-ridden old man and something the world refused to believe was real. The surprising truth? Bigfoot, the so-called monster of the woods, wasn't just real. It listened. It remembered. And in the stillness of the trees, it became the only soul to witness Harold Pennington's silent grief. This story comes straight from Harold's handwritten journal, discovered after his death, never before published, and hidden for decades. In the next few minutes, you'll see how. A scarred, young Bigfoot learned trust through quiet acts of kindness. A man, crushed by guilt, found redemption in the eyes of a creature thought to be wild, and how a single moment of courage forever rewrote what it means to be human. Harold lived alone for 28 years, speaking to no one. But one snowy morning, side by side on his porch, were two sets of footprints, one large, one small, walking toward the forest. That day, he began carving his story into birch bark, because no one else would believe it. Skip this video, and you'll never know why a wild creature risked its life to protect a broken man from a pack of wolves. This is a story buried in silence. Until now. The leaves had turned to fire along the hills of Jackson County, North Carolina. Red, gold, rust. All of them catching the last warmth of October and holding it like a secret before the wind came and scattered it into the river. The sun slipped behind the Smokies early these days, and down by the banks of the Tuckasegee, the air grew thin and still. You could hear your own breath if you stopped moving long enough. You could hear everything else too. The squirrels cracking walnuts under the laurel thickets, the wings of a crow slicing the fog. And when the wind cut through the cove just right, you could hear what wasn't supposed to be there. Harold Pennington had lived alone in this cabin for 15 years. A small structure leaning into the slope like an old hound curling beside the hearth. One room, one porch, a chimney that leaned slightly toward the sycamores. The forest had nearly swallowed it. Ferns and moss crawled up the back wall. Ivy twisted over the woodpile. A rusted lantern hung from a crooked nail beside the door, swaying a little even when there wasn't any breeze. Harold sat out there almost every evening when the weather allowed. He'd pull on his patched wool coat, light a little fire inside, then take his banjo out and settle onto the porch chair, the one with the creak in the left leg and a small hole in the seat where a squirrel once chewed through it. He played not for joy nor habit, but because some sounds need answers. And in these woods, silence was a kind of sorrow if you let it last too long. His fingers moved slow. They weren't what they used to be. Cold stiffened them quicker now, but the notes came soft and steady, carrying into the trees like smoke rising off hot ash. The tune tonight was one he hadn't played in years. He didn't think about the name of it anymore. It came from somewhere before things broke, before the wrong shift, before the scream and the wreck and the black car they sent him home in, before people stopped calling, before he stopped replying. The mountains had taken him in the way they take in everything, slowly and without asking questions. He paused to catch his breath. The banjo settled against his knee. His eyes wandered to the treetops shifting in the dying light. A crow called once, then again, then nothing, and then he heard it. At first, it came soft, like a thread unwinding between trees. A high, wavering sound, not quite human but close enough to stop his breath. It came again, long, hollow, thinner this time, but closer. He sat still, banjo silent, chest tight. It wasn't an owl, wasn't a fox. Wasn't the echo of some hiker playing games out in the dark. No one came this far back after dusk. Hell, most folks in Silva didn't even believe this place still had a trail to it. But Harold knew the sound of sorrow. And this wasn't wind whistling through dead pine. This was a cry, not the kind you answer with a flashlight and a pistol. The kind that makes you sit back, grip the arms of your chair, and remember every bad thing that's ever happened in the woods. He leaned forward, squinting into the dark. The trees were all still. No rustling, no movement, no crunch of leaf or branch. Just that sound. It didn't come again, but it left something behind in its place. That kind of silence that buzzes against your ribs, like a room waiting for something to fall. He waited 5 minutes, maybe 10, then stood up slowly, joints popping with the weight of cold and age. He didn't reach for a weapon, just turned and stepped inside, closing the door behind him softer than usual. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Shadows moved across the stone like breath. He added a piece of hickory, watched the sparks climb, and sat down beside it. The banjo leaned forgotten against the chair. He thought about pouring a glass of the old stuff, just enough to settle his nerves, but didn't. He listened instead, listened harder than he had in years. The wind shifted. Nothing came. The night moved on, slow and hollow. The next morning came like any other. Pale light on fog. Woodpecker hammering on a birch somewhere above the ridge. Harold stepped outside with a tin cup full of coffee and looked down the trail that wound past his coop, toward the bend in the river where the deer sometimes bedded. The air felt different, like something had passed through. He noticed it then. 3 small stones lined up at the foot of the porch, not placed with care, but not random either. He bent down, studied them. Smooth river stones, still damp. One had moss clinging to it. He didn't remember them being there the day before. Could have been raccoons, or a storm washing debris upslope. Could have been nothing at all. But he knew better. By late afternoon, the mist rolled in thick again, settling low across the holler. He went about his usual work, splitting wood, checking the traps, bringing in the eggs. The hens clucked nervously, as if something had moved through their world too. He said nothing to them, just gathered the shells and went back inside. At dusk, he played again. Not the same tune. Something older, something slower. But he didn't make it halfway through before the sound came again, the cry. This time sharper, a little closer, fading as it came, like it was circling. He sat still, staring into the line of trees beyond the porch. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. And when it stopped, there was nothing. No echo, no rustle, not even the wind. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire and stared at the door. Morning found him with ash on his boots and a kettle long gone cold. He stepped out into the gray light, rubbed the ache from his knees, and went to the creek for water. That's when he saw the track. 7 inches long, wider at the toe. The ground was soft with leaf melt and morning dew, but the print was deep. Not a bear, not a man. The toes were wrong, too broad, too flat. He followed the trail a few paces, but it veered off quick into bramble. No broken branches, no clear path. Just the print. Then another. Then gone. He didn't chase it. He went back to the cabin, cut off a piece of cornbread, wrapped some salted meat in a rag, and walked it out to the stump behind the smokehouse. Left it there. Didn't speak, didn't wait. Just walked back inside and closed the door behind him. That night the food was gone. No bones, no scraps, no claw marks. But the same 3 stones sat on the porch again. This time in a line. Dry, warm to the touch. The fire popped, and from deep in the woods, something waited. Watching, just beyond where the light could reach. Harold knew then. He'd opened something. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't finished with him yet. And when he sat down that night to play, hands steady, breath held, he looked into the trees and waited for it to call again, because some cries don't come just once. Some cries are looking for someone who might still remember how to answer. And even if you don't know what to say back, sometimes it's enough just to listen, even when you're not sure what's listening back. even when you're afraid of what it might need. Even when the river's quiet, the wind's asleep, and everything that once mattered is buried deep in the dirt behind you. Because something out there remembered. And Harold Pennington wasn't sure if that was mercy or warning. But either way, he left the porch light burning, just in case. By late November, the trees along the Tuckasegee had thinned to crooked fingers clutching at the cold. The last of the red maples had dropped their leaves. The light fell faster now, slipping behind the hills before Harold could finish chopping wood. The wind had a sharpness to it that cut through wool and bone. Smoke from his chimney curled low, hugging the cabin's pitch roof before vanishing into the gray. Everything had gone quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brought peace. This quiet felt like it was listening. Harold knew these woods, the way the water curved around the rocks, the way crows perched on the same limb each dusk, the way deer avoided the grove by the ridge after rain. He'd learned the rhythm of this place like a second pulse. But lately, that rhythm had shifted. Something was off, like the ground itself was waiting, like the trees were holding their breath. The cry hadn't come back for a few nights, but he hadn't forgotten. Couldn't. It lingered in the air, hung between branches. Sometimes he thought he caught the tail of it in the wind, and his hands would freeze mid-motion, breath caught in his chest. He didn't speak of it. There was no one to tell. But he felt it in his bones, same place he felt the cold and the guilt that never thawed. On a morning when the frost clung to every blade of grass like tiny glass daggers, Harold carried his pail down to the creek. The slope was slick, and his knees complained with each step. He moved careful now, not like the younger version of himself who once climbed railroad cars in the rain with a wrench in his hand and a fire in his gut. That man had died somewhere along the track, between a missed shift and a twisted wreck. What walked down to the creek these days was something quieter. Tired, still breathing but not fully living. He bent to dip the pail into the water, and that's when he saw it. Pressed into the mud beside the moss-covered rock was a print. Not his, not a boot. 7 inches long, maybe more. Broad, flat. The toes weren't separate, not like human ones. They seemed to blur into each other, like a mitten pressed into soft clay. The heel was shallow, but the ball of the foot had sunk deep, like it carried weight. Real weight. He stared at it for a long time. Could have been a bear. Maybe. But no claws. And the shape wasn't right. It didn't match any track he'd seen out here, and he'd seen plenty. Elk, bear, fox, bobcat, even the occasional black vulture dragging its wings through the mud. But this wasn't that. He looked up toward the slope, scanning the underbrush. Nothing moved, no birds, no rustle of rabbit or squirrel. Just the water, muttering past him, and the wind threading through the pines like an old woman braiding her hair. He stood slow, back stiff. Didn't bother to take the water. Just turned and walked back up the hill, eyes flicking toward the tree line every few steps. That night he left a biscuit and a strip of salt pork on the stump again. Didn't say a word. Didn't light the lantern. He just set it down and went back inside, locking the door behind him for the first time in months. Something about the print stuck with him. The weight of it. The direction it faced. Like something had stood there, watching. The next morning the food was gone, but this time something else had been left behind. Scratches, not claw marks, not random. Just 4 lines across the stump, like someone or something had dragged wide fingers through the frost. And below them, a faint smear of mud. Not blood, just dirt, but placed like a marker. Intentional. Harold didn't touch it. He just stared, mouth dry. That night, he didn't sleep. Every time the cabin creaked, he opened one eye. When the wind brushed the eaves, he sat up in bed, listening. The fire burned low, casting long shadows against the logs. He thought he heard footsteps once. Or maybe not footsteps exactly. A kind of rhythm, a shift in weight across the porch boards, like something heavy leaning in. But when he opened the door, there was only the night. and cold. By the fourth night, the cry returned. Not as loud as the first time, not as close, but different. It had rhythm now, not like speech, but like pattern. A sound trying to repeat itself, like an echo through thick trees. It rose and fell, then held, long enough to feel, not just hear. Harold sat by the window, eyes narrowed at the dark. The fire popped behind him. He didn't move. The sound faded, but it had left something behind. He stood at dawn, spine aching, and opened the door. The frost had returned. Crystals along the porch rail. The breath of winter just beginning to creep through the seams in the wood. Then he saw them. Two eyes, not close, just at the edge of the trees, reflecting orange from the dying lantern glow. Low to the ground, wide set. Still. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Just watched. Harold's breath caught. He didn't dare reach for the gun, didn't slam the door. He just stared back, long and even, letting his body go still like he was part of the cabin itself. After a moment, the eyes disappeared. No sound, no rush, just gone. He stood there for a while longer, then stepped back inside. Something was changing. The cry had a watcher now. Or maybe it had always been the same thing. Maybe he was just beginning to see the shape of it. That day he gathered more wood than usual. Not because he needed it, but because he couldn't sit still. He moved with purpose, stack after stack, like a man who knew something was coming and didn't want to be idle when it arrived. He checked the traps, reset them further from the cabin, the line near the creek. He left untouched. There was a stillness there now that unsettled him, as if it didn't belong to him anymore, as if the water had claimed it for something else. That night he didn't leave food. He left something different, an old corncob doll, handmade. His wife had stitched it years ago. He'd kept it in a box beneath the bed, alongside things he never spoke of. But now he placed it gently on the stump, facing the woods. No note, no words, just the doll. And when morning came, it was gone. In its place, a single crow feather, black, perfect, centered on the stump like a sign. He picked it up without thinking, held it in his hand like something sacred. Not because it had value, but because something had traded for it. Something had seen what he left and given something back. It wasn't animal. It wasn't wild. It was choice. The next night, when the eyes came again, they stood closer. Not in the trees, at the edge of the yard. Behind the coop, still watching. Harold opened the door and stood there, firelight spilling out behind him. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. The wind moved between them, and he knew, deep in the place beneath words, that whatever this was, it knew him now too. It had seen his sorrow, heard his music, watched his routines. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that didn't run, something that waited, something that watched just long enough for him to know it would return. Not to scare, but to ask. And Harold, though he didn't understand the question, was beginning to learn how to answer. Because you don't speak to the forest with words. You speak with offerings, with silences, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you are not alone. Not anymore. Not out here. Not when the trees remember your name, and the eyes come back each night, just a little bit closer. Each time, staying just a little bit longer. The first frost of December had settled deep into the cracks of the mountain by the time it showed itself. Snow hadn't come yet, but the earth was holding its breath. Mornings were colder, quieter, and the trees now stood stripped bare, reaching upward like bones. On the ridge behind the cabin, mist hung thick between the trunks, and the wind moved slow, carrying a silence that felt like it had been earned. Harold rose before the light, built the fire, warmed his hands around a chipped enamel mug, and stepped outside with the weight of something unshaken pressed behind his ribs. For weeks now, that presence had circled, stared, left gifts, taken food, echoed cries through the night trees that didn't belong to any animal he knew. But he hadn't seen it. Not fully. Not until that morning. Not until the fog rolled low enough that the treetops vanished and the ground turned the color of steel. He was splitting wood beside the shed, his breath white against the air, the swing of the axe a rhythm that steadied him more than coffee ever could. Each crack of wood echoed back from the hills like a slow metronome, heartbeat by heartbeat. He just finished with the last round. The blade sunk deep into a thick knot when something made him stop. Not a sound, not a shadow. Just the sudden certainty that he wasn't alone. He turned his head, slow, deliberate. There, maybe 15 feet away, standing just beyond the broken fence line, half hidden behind a rhododendron bush that still held onto a few dry leaves. It wasn't crouching. It wasn't hiding. It was just there, watching, 4 feet tall, maybe a hair taller, covered in dark fur tangled with bits of bark and clumps of damp leaves. Mud crusted its lower legs. One arm hung limp. The other bent slightly, fingers half curled like it hadn't decided yet if it should run. Its eyes were the first thing Harold truly noticed. Not wild, not glowing, not the eyes of something trying to frighten or claim territory. Just dark, wide, deep in the sockets, and looking straight at him, afraid, but not for itself. Harold blinked. His pulse stuttered. The axe was still in his hand, frozen in the log. His mouth opened, but no words came. Slowly, without turning his back, he bent down beside the stump, reached into the pocket of his coat, and pulled out the piece of rabbit meat he'd smoked the day before. He placed it gently on the wood, stepped back once, twice, and stayed still. The creature didn't move for a long while, not even a twitch. The wind moved around them both, curling through the trees, dragging mist along the ground like a wet sheet. Then it stepped forward, hesitant, each step light, as if the ground might give way. It crossed the clearing without a sound, reached the stump, paused. Its hand came up slow, wide palm, fingers longer than any child's, nails blackened but blunt. It picked up the meat, backed away, turned, and disappeared into the trees, as if the fog had swallowed it whole. Harold stood frozen until his knees ached, and the fire inside began to call him back. He went in, stoked the coals, and sat by the hearth, staring into the flames for the better part of an hour. He didn't tell himself it was a trick of the light. He didn't say it was a bear cub, malformed or orphaned. He knew what he'd seen, and it had seen him too. That night he didn't sleep easy. He dreamed of rail tracks, twisted metal, and the sound of something calling his name through thick smoke. He woke coughing, ribs tight, breath wheezing sharp and wet in the dark. He sat up, fumbled for the kettle, and put water over the fire to boil. His lungs hadn't felt this bad in years. The cold had always settled deep, and the old cough sometimes came back like a ghost. While he waited for the water to steam, he stepped onto the porch to catch his breath. The moon was low and full, hanging yellow above the tree line. The wind was still. Too still. That's when he saw it. Right there on the edge of the steps. A strip of birch bark. Clean. Placed with care. He knelt with effort and picked it up. On the smooth side, etched in with some sharp point, were two parallel lines. Not crooked, not carved in haste. Just two simple strokes, one longer than the other. He held it in his hand and stared into the dark beyond the clearing. There was no sound, no movement, but he felt it, like a hum in the bones, like someone watching not to judge, but to understand. He tucked the bark inside his coat, left the door unlatched when he went back in. The next morning brought rain, hard and cold. The path to the creek turned slick. The sky hung low and colorless. Harold stayed inside, wrapped in his wool blanket, his chest heavy with phlegm and fire. He sat by the stove, the birch bark still resting on the table beside him. By mid-afternoon, the rain had stopped. The woods steamed gently, water dripping from the eaves, from the pine needles, from the edges of every roof shingle. He thought about playing his banjo, but his fingers ached. So he listened. He'd gotten used to the silence, but this felt different. Not empty, just quiet, the kind that waits. That night he lit a candle and set it on the porch rail. Not bright, just enough to cast a glow against the fog. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe to offer something small. Maybe to let whoever, or whatever, was out there know that the door wasn't closed. He sat beside the window, listening to the wind, to the rustle of the woods trying to dry. And then it came. A sound not loud, but near. Soft breath, wet feet, a weight on the steps. He didn't move, just listened. His cough returned, sharp this time, hacking deep from his chest. He covered his mouth, wheezed through it. Silence followed. Then, just outside, the faintest scrape against the porch wood. He waited. Then rose, slow and aching. When he opened the door, there was nothing there, but on the same step, right beside the birch bark from before, lay a second offering, a dried laurel branch, still greenish in places, laid gently across the birch in perfect parallel. The message wasn't lost on him. This wasn't random. This wasn't wild instinct. This was communication, careful, conscious, something that had been watching not just him, but his pain, his cough, his stories whispered to the dark. And it had answered. He brought the branch inside, laid it beside the first, sat with them for a long while. No fire, no lamp, just candlelight and breath. When he finally did light the stove again, he turned and looked once more out the window. The mist was heavier now, thicker, but in it, just on the edge of shadow, he thought he saw a shape. Small, still, not hiding, just waiting. And though the figure vanished as fast as it came, Harold didn't feel fear. Not the kind that makes you reach for a weapon, but the kind that makes you wonder what would happen if you reached out your hand instead. The kind that makes you think that even grief, even guilt, even years lost to silence and regret, might still find their own strange answers out here. And as the wind swept through the trees and the candle on the rail burned low, Harold sat in the stillness and whispered to no one, "I see you." And he knew, deep down, someone had already said it back. The wind that blew through Tuckasegee in mid-December had a bite to it, sharp as old wire, and it didn't let up come morning. It pushed through the cracks in Harold's cabin walls, howled under the porch slats, and crept along the floor like it meant to claim something. The trees outside swayed but didn't break. They knew this rhythm. Deep winter was coming fast, and it was coming quiet. No snow yet, but the sky hung low like it was thinking about it. The air tasted of wood smoke, iron, and something ancient. Harold sat by the stove with his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of sassafras tea. The fire inside cracked and hissed as the frost on his boots began to melt into the pine wood floor. His breath rattled now and then, not just from the cold, but from the weight in his chest that had come back stronger than usual. The nights were harder lately. Not because he was scared. He wasn't. He didn't think he was. It was something else. Something about that small shape outside the cabin weeks ago. Those black eyes. The branch laid across the birch bark like a message meant just for him. It haunted his sleep in a strange way. Not like a nightmare, but like a memory he hadn't lived yet. He hadn't seen the creature again. Not fully, but he felt it. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, air sharp and dry, and sense something just beyond the door. No footsteps, no breath, just presence. Sometimes, when he stepped out to piss before bed, he'd catch a whiff of something in the wind. Damp earth, matted fur, wet cedar. Not foul, just wild. And that morning, as the sun dragged its pale belly across the ridge, Harold did something he hadn't done since moving here. He opened the cabin door and left it open. Not all the way, just a hand's width. Enough for heat to spill out and meet the cold, like two ghosts passing each other on a stairwell. He let the wind carry it. Let the cabin breathe. Let the scent of wood smoke and stew and old flannel float into the trees. Then he waited. He sat back in his chair near the fire, pulled the blanket over his knees, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, just to listen. The woods had a sound to them when something was near, not always loud. Sometimes the silence changed in shape, the space between the rustling, the weight of air against the windows. He knew how to hear it. Like a tune played too slow, you didn't catch the melody unless you leaned in close. He didn't hear footsteps. But after an hour, the light shifted. And in that faint shift, he opened his eyes and saw the edge of a shadow lean against the outside wall, just beside the doorframe. Not a threat, just a shape. Waiting, he didn't move. The fire popped behind him. The wind breathed against the open space, and in that long, frozen hour, Harold Pennington began to talk, not to himself, not to the shadow, but to something older inside him. The part that had carried guilt for 15 years, buried under wood smoke and banjo strings, and the lie he told himself every morning when he woke up and pretended it was just another day. He spoke of 1972, of the shift he wasn't supposed to take, the call from the yard boss, the rails frozen solid, the vibration in his hand from the coupling rod that he swore he tightened, the radio static, the call that never came, the scream of metal folding, and the names, Miriam and Joshua. The way they said goodbye without knowing it was for good. He told it all, soft, with pauses between every other word, like he wasn't sure if the telling would kill him or save him, and the shadow never left. He could feel it still, just beyond the crack in the door, still and listening. And when the last word fell out of him like a dying ember, the air shifted again. Not colder, not warmer, just softer. The shape was gone. He didn't rise, didn't shut the door. He just sat there, letting the cold in, letting the fire burn low, letting the weight bleed out through the floorboards into the dirt. He didn't know if the creature understood language. He didn't even know if it understood sorrow. But something in its silence felt like permission, like a nod, like the world had heard him and decided not to spit him out just yet. The next morning, he stepped onto the porch with a hand on his ribs, the cough having carved a raw groove in his lungs. The sun hadn't cleared the trees yet. A fine layer of hoarfrost clung to the steps, and each board groaned beneath his feet. That's when he saw it. The birch bark and the laurel branch were still there, but now beside them lay a third object, a dried seed pod from a milkweed, carefully opened, its white tufts plucked clean, except for two that stood upright like antennae. He didn't touch it right away. He just stood, staring. Then something settled in him. A knowing. This wasn't mimicry. This was communication. Not words, not tools, but rhythm, a pattern, a language older than any alphabet. 3 offerings, 3 nights, 3 answers. Harold nodded to no one. He went inside, stoked the fire, brewed more tea. The ache in his chest hadn't lifted, but something else had shifted. Like his body still ached, but the silence didn't. He could breathe through the pain without flinching now. That afternoon, as clouds bunched low over the valley and the first flakes of snow whispered through the bare trees, he stepped outside with one of Miriam's old quilts. He walked it to the stump where he used to leave food and laid it out flat. Then, beside it, he placed a tin cup of warm water, a few slices of roasted squash, and a spoonful of lard from the smokehouse. He didn't say anything, just stepped back into the cabin and waited. Night fell slow, heavy. The wind shifted east, and sometime around midnight, he stirred from half-sleep to the faintest brush against the cabin door. Not a knock, not a scrape, just pressure. He rose, knees aching, and opened the door. There, at the edge of the porch light, half lit by fire glow and shadow, was the small figure. Fur wet from snow, eyes darker than the night behind it. Mud clung to its knees, There was a tremble in its shoulders, not from fear, but cold. Harold stepped back slow, left the door open just a little wider. The creature didn't move, but it didn't run. It sat, just at the edge of the threshold, where the porch boards turned from frost to warmth. It crouched there, curling its arms around its legs, head low but alert. And Harold, without saying a word, turned back toward the fire and sat down again. The silence held. The door stayed open. The creature stayed where it was, still and small in the glow of flickering light. And by the time the sun crested over the ridgeline, the snow had dusted the roof, and the creature was gone. But on the floor near the threshold, laid carefully between two muddy footprints, were the three tokens: birch, laurel, milkweed, arranged again. But this time, the two lines carved in the bark had been extended. Longer now, as if the path had grown. And Harold knew he wasn't the only one who'd let something in. And whatever they were to each other, man and creature, stranger and shadow, they had started speaking, not with voices, but with doors, with patience, with the warmth of something left ajar just long enough for trust to slip through. And though the cold still bit and the cough still clawed, he'd left the door open again that morning, a little wider than the day before, because some things don't need a welcome, just a chance. And something in the woods had decided to answer. The wind changed the night the wolves came, not just colder, but meaner, leaner, like it carried sharp teeth between gusts. It was the kind of night when the forest didn't creak or moan. It held still. Even the crows had gone quiet. Even the river sounded like it was holding its breath. Snow had fallen fast earlier that afternoon, clinging to the pine branches and draping the clearing around Harold's cabin in a kind of muffled hush. But now it had stopped, and the silence that followed was too complete to trust. Harold had felt it long before he saw anything. The kind of prickling stillness you get in your ribs when something's wrong but hasn't introduced itself yet. He hadn't seen the small creature in nearly a week, though the offerings kept coming. Little bits of cedar bark, smooth stones arranged in lines, a small pine cone with its scales peeled just so. He'd left warm soup and cloth scraps by the porch each night, and they'd been taken every time. There was something quiet and steady about that exchange. But not tonight. Tonight, the air was too thick. He had just finished banking the fire, drawing the heavy curtain across the window, when his old hound instincts, buried deep but not dead, told him to stand still and listen. The trees outside were whispering in a way that didn't belong to the wind. He stepped to the porch door, cracked it open slow, and felt the cold slap his face. Then he heard it. A low growl, not distant, not curious, close. He stepped out farther, eyes adjusting to the snow glow. Moonlight reflected off everything like the forest had turned to bone. That's when he saw them. Shapes moving in the dark between the trees, low to the ground, tails raised, bodies tense. Wolves. 3, maybe 4. Gaunt with winter hunger. Eyes catching the light like coals. They weren't yipping or barking. They were circling. Harold's breath caught. He wasn't helpless. Not entirely. But he wasn't 30 anymore either. He stepped back inside, grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth, and held it low. It wasn't much. Not against a pack. But it was something. Then a snarl came from the left. Closer now. One of them had come around the side of the cabin. He didn't yell. Didn't panic. He knew panic was how men got torn apart in their own doorways. He moved back, reached behind him for the lantern, and turned up the flame. The wolves didn't flinch. Then something shifted. There was a sound, not loud, but deep. A growl, not from a throat of a dog or a man. It came from the trees, heavy, warning, and Harold felt it in his knees. A shape stepped forward into the edge of light. Not the big one, not the giant he still sometimes dreamed of, but the young one, the one with the eyes that didn't run. It moved slow, but deliberate. Between Harold and the wolves, the pack bristled. One of them snapped at the air, a dry clack of teeth. The small creature didn't flinch. It crouched low, baring its teeth. Not like an animal, but something older. A show of control. Its arms went wide, shoulders raised. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It stood, not fully upright, just enough to show its height, its strength, its unyielding presence. And that was enough. The wolves didn't bolt. Not right away. They growled, paced, snarled in protest. But then, one by one, they peeled back into the trees, their hunger not strong enough to challenge whatever this was. The last one lingered longer, tail twitching, head low. Then it, too, turned and melted into the dark. The creature stayed still a moment longer. Its chest rose and fell heavy. Then, slowly, it looked over its shoulder. Not at the woods, at Harold. Not a stare, not a command, just acknowledgement. And then it stepped back into the trees, gone like it had never been there. Harold exhaled, long and shaking. He lowered the poker, leaned it against the wall, and sat down on the step like his knees might not hold. He stared out into the trees, heart thumping loud in his ears, and whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, the snow around the porch was crisscrossed with tracks. Not just the small ones. There were larger ones now, deeper, wider, not from the wolves, from something that had been watching too. He followed them just far enough to see where they turned toward the southern trail, then stopped. No need to go farther. Something else had come in the night, and left proof. He didn't speak of it aloud, not even to the trees, but something in him shifted. That afternoon, he walked the perimeter of his cabin, past the coop, down the trail toward the traps he hadn't checked in weeks, and he saw it then. One of the steel-jaw traps, old, rusted, but still cruel, was snapped shut, blood crusted along the edge, and beside it, a tuft of dark fur. His stomach turned. He hadn't set this one in months, had meant to remove them all, but this one had been left, forgotten. And now he knew where the creature's limp had come from. His hands curled into fists. He took a rock and shattered the trap open, then walked deeper into the brush, found the others he'd staked in fall, and smashed every last one. By the time he finished, his palms were cut, blood dark against the snow. He carried the pieces in an old flour sack and buried them by the firewood pile, deep under the roots. Let the rust stay buried. That night he left no food, no gifts. Just silence. But when he woke the next morning, there was something new on the porch. Another strip of birch bark, this time carved not with 2 lines, but 3, parallel. Still close, still traveling the same way. But now, one of them bent at the end. A curve, like a fork in the road, like a choice. He ran his thumb over it, heart tight. They knew. They had seen. And still they had come. Still they had protected him. Forgiven him. He sat with that for a long time, long after the sun climbed the ridge, long after the fire in the stove died down to its last red core. He didn't play the banjo that day, didn't speak aloud. He just waited. And when night fell again, he stepped onto the porch, looked out into the trees, and said only one thing. "I'm sorry." He didn't expect an answer. But deep in the woods, from somewhere near the place the river bent west, a long, low sound rolled through the trees. Not sad, not angry, just steady, like an old drum or a heart still beating. Still here, still listening. By the time February leaned into its second week, the Tuckasegee was no longer a river but a thing alive. Angry, swollen, wide. Ice had snapped from its banks like teeth breaking loose. Meltwater roared down from the hills above, brown and fast, dragging logs and silt and broken branches with it. The snow hadn't vanished so much as bled. What had once been a soft white hush turned to mud and foam and motion. The trees leaned in different directions now, like they'd been listening to something too long and didn't know how to stand up straight anymore. Harold knew the signs before they ever reached his clearing. He'd lived long enough by moving water to understand its moods, and this one had turned. For 3 days straight, the rain came hard, harder than any he'd seen in years. It hadn't soaked the earth. It had pounded it, breaking up routes and paths and scents. On the third morning, a cedar behind his cabin fell without warning, roots torn out like old memories. His cough had worsened again, deep and hollow, like something knocking from inside his chest and asking to be let out. He stayed close to the fire, wrapped in wool, one hand always resting on the old quilt Miriam had stitched. The birch bark offering still rested on the mantel in quiet ceremony, a map he didn't know how to read but refused to throw away. Sometimes at night, the young creature would still come. It never entered, never crossed the threshold, but it had grown comfortable sitting beneath the porch, legs folded, head tilted as if waiting. Neither of them spoke. They just listened. To the fire, to the wind, to the silence of something building between them. That morning, the fourth day of rain, the sun finally returned. A thin slice of gold between slate clouds, enough to see the damage. The river had risen to touch the edge of the clearing. Trees that once stood firm along the bank now leaned like drunks. Harold knew it was dangerous to go down there. Knew that at his age, with the cough in his lungs and the slip in his knees, he had no business near rushing water. But one of the younger cedars had fallen across the bend in a way that blocked the runoff. The current slammed into it hard, splashing and backing up. If it held too long, it could shift the river's course. And if the river shifted, it would come straight for the cabin. So he bundled up, laced his boots tight, grabbed the old iron hook he used for hauling logs, and started down the slope. The ground was slick and loud with suction. Each step made a sucking sound, like the earth didn't want to let go. He paused twice to catch his breath, leaning on trees that didn't feel steady enough. But he kept going. By the time he reached the edge of the water, the cold had chewed through his gloves. The river rushed before him like a thing possessed, wide and furious. The log lay sideways, wedged against a boulder, pinned tight, but already splintering at one end. He could see the pressure building, hear it in the way the water slapped the trunk. He didn't think. He just moved. He stepped down onto a flat stone, water licking the edges of his boots. Reached forward with a hook, dug it into the upper branch. He pulled once, twice. The trunk shifted slightly. A loud crack popped from beneath the current. He braced himself and pulled again. The wood moved. Then it jerked hard, sliding toward him. The stone under his foot tilted. And that was it. One moment he stood on rock and grit and fight. The next, the ground was gone. The current took him like it had been waiting for him. Cold slammed his ribs. His breath vanished. The sky disappeared. He didn't scream. Didn't have time. Just water. Brown and blind and fast. It punched him into itself, tumbled him, dragged him against stone and root and debris. His hand scraped past something. Maybe the branch, maybe not. His chest burned. A sound tried to rise in his throat, but never made it out. Then, like a line going taut, something caught. Not his foot, not a tree. A hand, or something like it. It didn't grab him like a man would. Didn't jerk, just held. A grip that came from behind, under the water, around his middle. Strong, solid, pulling against the river's fury. He came up gasping, coughing, choking on gravel and silt. Something hauled him backward, step by step. He felt ground scrape under him, then moss, then bark. He blinked up at gray sky and rain-wet branches, and then he saw it. Not the small one, but the large one, the shape he'd only imagined, only heard. 9 feet tall at least, broad like the trunk of an old oak. Covered in dark, matted fur soaked from head to heel. Its chest heaved slow, deliberate. One massive hand still held Harold under the arm. The other pressed to the ground, steadying both of them. Harold coughed so hard he thought his ribs might crack. His vision swam. The wind stung his eyes. He tried to speak, but nothing came. The creature didn't move. It stared at him, eyes deep, dark, unblinking. Not wild, not kind, just steady. And then, from the trees above, the smaller one appeared. It hurried down the slope, awkward on the mud, but fast. It carried something in its arms. Dry grass, pine straw, bark stripped from under cedar. It knelt beside him and began tucking the straw around his chest, his legs, his sides. The movement was careful, not frantic, just sure. One piece at a time, pressing the warmth close. The big one stayed silent. After a while, it stood, turned its head slightly, looked at the young one. Something passed between them. Not words, not gestures, just breath. And then it walked back into the trees, silent, gone. Harold lay there, eyes fluttering, the straw scratching against his chin, the wet mud beneath him slowly losing its bite. The small creature stayed. It placed a palm on his shoulder. Its fingers splayed wide across his chest. Not a grip, not pressure, just contact. His cough came again, hard and brutal. The creature leaned close, then sat still. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Harold didn't feel alone. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But he reached up, hand trembling, and laid it over the one that touched him. Neither moved. The sky dimmed again, evening creeping faster than it should. And still, they sat like that. Two beings, one from the trees, one from the world that had forgotten how to listen. And something held between them that neither could explain, but both knew was real. Later, much later, when Harold could finally stand, the creature helped him up with slow patience. It didn't guide him, didn't lead. It walked beside him, back up the slope, back toward the cabin. And when they reached the porch, it didn't follow him inside. It stopped, turned, vanished into the trees. But Harold didn't close the door that night. He left it open wide, let the firelight spill out onto the snow, let the warmth walk free, let the forest know it was welcome. Because sometimes, when something saves your life, it doesn't owe you an explanation. It just wants you to remember, and he would. He always would. Spring didn't arrive with a trumpet blast in Tuckasegee. It didn't shout or shine or declare anything. It slipped in like a ghost easing into a warm room. The ice melted from the rocks first. Quiet, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it belonged. Then came the mud, rich and black, and the smell of waking earth. A scent Harold hadn't realized he missed until it found him again. Mornings no longer bit at his fingers. Birds began to sing again, not in flocks, not in chorus, but in scattered, cautious notes, like they were trying to remember old songs from the year before. Somewhere behind the cabin, a woodpecker tapped against the hollow heart of a pine. Harold stood on the porch with his coffee cupped in both hands, the steam rising slow into the pale blue morning. His ribs still ached from the river, but the bruises had turned yellow and the cough, for now, had faded back into its cave. He watched the mist lift off the treetops and thought about how much he hadn't said in the past few months. Not because he didn't want to, but because silence had grown into something sacred, something shared. You don't talk when you're being listened to that closely. You sit, you wait, you breathe. He hadn't seen the big one again, not since the flood. But he hadn't expected to. Some debts are paid in full and then walked away from. But the smaller one, the young one, had returned every few nights. Sometimes it would sit beneath the porch and listen to the fire crackle. Sometimes it left little things. A twist of moss tied with vine, a flat rock shaped like an arrowhead, the curled husk of a snail laid carefully in the center of the welcome mat, always placed with purpose, always facing the same direction, forward. Harold didn't try to name it, didn't try to own it with a word. To name it would be to tame it, to make it small. And what sat beside his cabin on those quiet spring nights was not small. That morning, something felt different. The air was too still, not ominous, just waiting. He spent the day chopping wood that didn't need chopping, tending to a fire that didn't need tending. Around noon, he noticed the chickens hadn't left the coop. Not a sound from them. He glanced toward the tree line, but nothing moved. Just before sundown, he heard it. A soft shuffle at the edge of the clearing. Not the usual slow approach. Not the quiet patience. This time, it was more deliberate, more final. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the trees. And there it was. The young one stood upright near the woodpile, hands at its sides. Its fur looked cleaner, darker with healthy oils. Its shoulders broader. There was something steadier in its posture. A stillness that wasn't just calm. It was maturity. Growth. And behind it, standing farther back in the shadows, just where the light stopped touching the ground, was the larger one. Watching, unmoving, just like the first time. Harold didn't speak, didn't wave. He just stood there with the air in his chest, trembling like something sacred had entered the room. The young one stepped forward, and for the first time, it didn't stop at the porch. It climbed it. Slow, sure, no hesitation. And then it stood in front of him. Close enough he could see the lines beneath its eyes. The scar around its ankle where the trap had once bitten in. The scar was healing now. Thick, but no longer red. Strong. It looked up at him, then reached out. Not fast, not sudden. It placed a hand gently on his wrist. The same wrist he'd wrapped in a rag, soaked with pine sap weeks before, after the river tried to take him. The same wrist that had been purple with bruising, and it held there for just a breath. Then it stepped back, turned, walked toward the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, it paused. Looked over its shoulder. Harold didn't ask where it was going. Didn't ask why. He knew. This wasn't abandonment. It was the parting of two paths that had walked beside each other long enough to know they'd changed each other. And when the creature vanished into the trees, following the large figure into the deeper dark, Harold didn't follow. He just stood there until the light went out of the sky. He turned back toward the door, hand on the knob, then stopped. There on the step, right where the creature had stood, was a strip of birch bark, longer than the others. The two lines that had once run side by side now extended further. But this time, at the end of one line, a faint curve turned away. Not broken, not lost, just different. Moving on, he picked it up, turned it in his hand. There was a stone beneath it, flat, smooth. It had been carved, shallow but clear, with the shape of a spiral. No beginning, no end, just motion. Harold closed his fingers around it, walked inside, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't close the door all the way. He left it open a few inches, the way he had in December, back when trust had been a guess instead of a knowing. The fire burned steady. Outside, the wind shifted east, and somewhere beyond the trees, something large moved through the underbrush without fear, because it knew the man in the cabin wasn't afraid anymore either. He was still alone, but not lonely, and that's different. Sometimes it takes the whole winter to realize that healing doesn't always look like forgetting. Sometimes it looks like two beings touching hands once in silence, and then walking their own way again, but always leaving the path open, just in case. By June, the river had calmed into a whisper. Whatever fury it had carried through winter and flood had smoothed out into steady breath. The banks had softened, green now with new sedge and pale wildflowers that grew in places where mud had once stood waist deep. Birds darted between the trees with full bellies and bright songs. The air carried the damp scent of moss and warm pine, and the sky stretched wide above Jackson County, Carolina blue with just a breath of cloud near the ridgeline. The forest no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. Harold sat on the porch most mornings now, not because he had nothing left to do, but because time no longer rushed him. There was a rhythm to his days. Coffee first, then a slow lap around the cabin to check the coop and the stacked wood. After that, he might shave bark off cedar for kindling, or walk down to the flat stone by the river just to sit, not to fish, not to fix anything, just to be there while the sun warmed his boots and the breeze passed through the folds of his coat. He didn't say much out loud anymore. Words weren't as necessary as they used to be. Silence had grown comfortable, trusted. The kind of silence that only takes root after something big has left and the ground has had time to settle. He still coughed now and then, but it wasn't the deep, wrenching bark of winter. More like a habit his body hadn't forgotten how to perform. His chest had room again. His breath was his own. He hadn't seen the young creature since that last evening in early spring. The moment it placed its hand on his wrist, then turned toward the trees with something in its gait that didn't look back. Harold hadn't gone searching. He'd known better than that. You don't chase what chooses to leave you gently. You hold that kind of parting with both hands and say thank you under your breath. But there were signs. Not every day, but enough to feel the truth of it. Small things. Fresh prints along the edge of the garden patch. A row of river stones arranged along the creek like a path. Twice, he'd woken to find the porch broom laid across the threshold, its handle pointing east. The bristles tied with a strip of birch bark. No carvings this time, just placement. Like punctuation. He never moved those things, just watched as wind and rain slowly reclaim them. And sometimes, just before sunrise, he'd hear movement on the far bank. Not footsteps, not voice, just weight, just breath. Something letting him know it was near. Not checking in, just being. He had stopped trying to explain any of it, even to himself. Especially to himself. Instead, he lived. The hens laid again. Wildflowers crept up the porch steps. The nights were warm enough now to sleep with the window cracked open, and more than once, he dreamed of cedar branches moving in the wind and woken to the scent of moss he couldn't place. It was early evening when he walked to the river's edge that final time, just before the sun dipped behind the western hills. The light spilled gold across the water, casting his shadow long across the stones. He stood there a while, letting the hush take hold, until he knelt slowly, knees aching, and placed a carved pinewood figure at the base of two trees whose roots had grown into each other like clasped hands. It wasn't fancy, just a rough form. A man sitting beside a smaller figure, legs crossed, heads tilted the same way. He didn't mean it as a message. He wasn't asking for return. It was a way of leaving something behind that wasn't pain. It was a way of saying, I remember. The breeze shifted. A crow called once from the slope. Harold stood again and turned back toward the cabin. Not fast, not slow. Just moving like a man who no longer needed to hurry. At the door, he paused. In the packed earth beside the steps, in the still warm dust, were two lines of tracks. Small, wide-toed. Not fresh, but not old either. Side by side, one slightly ahead of the other. The weight in them soft. No drag. Just passing through. He didn't smile. Not exactly. But something in his chest lifted just a little. The kind of lifting that doesn't ask for more. He walked inside and poured a glass of water. Sat down in his chair. The fire didn't need tending, but he placed a new log anyway. Habit. Ritual. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the strip of bark he'd kept from that last visit. The one with the lines that turned away from each other but still traveled in the same direction. He held it a moment, then set it gently atop the mantel beside the others. A map, he thought. Not of where they'd gone, but of who they'd become. Later that night, after the light had faded and the forest had quieted back into its summer hush, he stepped out once more to check the porch, just to look, just to breathe. The stars were out. The moon hung low. The breeze moved slow through the clearing, touching leaves and water and roof in equal measure. Harold didn't expect anything, and that was why it mattered when it came. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for wind. 2 knocks, then 1, low, measured, far off in the trees. Then silence, not the silence of goodbye, but the kind that says we're still walking, just on different sides of the trail. He stood there for a long while after that, listening, not for more sound, but for what it left behind. And in that stillness, something opened in him again. Not memory, not grief, just space. A space where something wild had lived, and still might. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. The kind that don't shout for attention or ask for applause, but instead settle softly into the corners of our hearts and wait to be understood. Not every connection needs words. Not every wound needs fixing, and not every goodbye is meant to be final. There are bonds that are built not with promises, but with patience. acts of care, shared silence. The kind of gestures that go unnoticed to most, but speak volumes to those who have known deep loss, or deep love, or both. In a world that moves too fast and forgets too easily, there is something sacred about slowing down and truly seeing what's around you. The way a river changes its course after a storm, or how trust can grow between two beings who don't speak the same language, but somehow understand each other perfectly. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from the answers we're given, but from the questions we learn to carry. That even when paths diverge, they can still run parallel in spirit. That compassion isn't weakness, it's legacy. And that sometimes just showing up for someone, or something, is enough. Because in the end, it's not about taming the wild or naming the unknown. It's about sharing the trail while we can, and when the time comes to part ways, to do so with grace, with gratitude, and with the door still open, just a little. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for sitting with this story through its quiet turns and its unspoken truths. If this touched something in you, something tender, something you thought was long gone, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what stayed with you, what made you pause, what you'll carry forward. And if you haven't yet, we'd be honored if you'd follow the channel, subscribe, and help us keep telling stories like this. Stories that whisper instead of shout, that remember instead of rush, and that remind us we're never really walking alone. We're glad you're here, and we hope you stay.